Let's think about a hospital as a monopolist. And for the moment, we'll think about the scenario where they have a private market, but they also have government patients. So to make it easier, let's just imagine right now that they have like Medicare patients, and the reimbursement is set by the federal government. So that means that they don't have a choice about what it's going to be. So let's imagine that there's demand in the market. So this is demand private, and that as the price would drop, this is what people would be willing to pay. Now, to make it simpler, let's imagine every single patient is the same cost. So let's just say everybody costs $100. So it's costing them $100 no matter for each additional patient, no matter how many there are. And just to make it simple, let's imagine that the Medicare reimbursement rate is like $120, no matter how many patients they serve. So with a reimbursement rate like that, what we're imagining is there's as many patients available as the hospital would want to serve. So there's plenty of patients. So there's basically excess demand, and that makes sense both because they're older patients and because we're showing the government as the payer, not the patient. So in this scenario, we want to think about what would the monopolist want to charge as a fee to the private patient. So we have two questions. What fee or what price and quantity for the private patients, and what quantity makes sense for the Medicare patients. There's plenty of them, but if we have a limited capacity in our hospital, we want to choose the right mix of these. And for the moment, we're thinking about this scenario for the hospital as they are profit maximizing. So if they were profit maximizing, what would they do? Okay, so remember, when you're a monopolist, every time you try to serve an additional patient or you create additional output, the only way you can sell more is to lower the price. So you are generating a different marginal revenue based on what you've chosen for quantity. So we have marginal revenue that goes for the monopolist. And if you've forgotten from 101, just review your monopoly chapter. But also, let's keep in mind that marginal revenue has twice the slope of demand. So that's a condition of the marginal revenue curve. So if this was 0 and this was 10, then this must have been 20. Okay, so now we're going to think about what makes sense for the monopolist to do. So at the very beginning, if I had a choice between receiving this amount for a Medicare patient or this amount from a private patient, then this is a higher marginal revenue than R1. So the first patient I would want is clearly a private patient. Now, if I'm going to serve the next patient, the marginal revenue of the next patient is lower, but the marginal revenue of the next Medicare patient is the same. continuing on, this marginal revenue of a private patient is higher than this marginal revenue, which is always the same for Medicare. So what happens is up to this point, all those private patients were better than a Medicare patient. So I'm just making up numbers here. Let's say it's 8. So when marginal revenue for private is greater than marginal revenue from R1 Medicare, which is flat, this is the same as marginal revenue, because if you've got $120 every single time, then incremental revenue is $120. So if marginal revenue private is bigger than marginal revenue that you get from Medicare, then we would choose private. If you notice, like on the very next patient right here, marginal revenue private has fallen below marginal revenue of Medicare. So we're going to choose quantity equals 8 for private. So that's what we're going to choose for quantity of private. And then beyond that point, what we would do is we would continually serve government patients. And you want to think about R1 as their demand curve. So we could serve government patients forever until we hit capacity. So let's suppose that we had this many total beds in the facility. Again, I'm making up numbers. Let's say that was 16. So if, maybe I'm going to make it 17. You'll see why in a second. If the maximum capacity was 17, then we would choose 8 of the beds will be private, 9 of the beds will be Medicare, and their sum is 17. That's capacity in my hospital. So I made it a different number than 16 so that you could see that where my numbers were coming from. So this is private, and these are government. And we already know the price for government, so the last thing I'm going to sort out is what would be the price for the private patients. If you remember for monopolists, to find the price, you look at how much the quantity was, and you realize that if you come straight up, they would charge the maximum price they are able to in order to sell or to satisfy the market for the quantity they wanted to produce. So this is price private, whatever it may be. So price private is, as we can see, it's higher than the Medicare price, but the Medicare price has affected how many places we're going to give to the private market. For example, without the Medicare price in there, the normal rule with a monopolist is they produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, which would be here. You can see that a little bit of the private market that would have happened is absorbed and reduced in order that we can serve those Medicare patients. And not just because they're being generous, it is actually more profitable to cut back the private patients a little bit, boost their price a little bit, and then use some of that room for Medicare patients.